Hi, welcome back to Learn Buffalo in Go. This video is about user authentication. One advantage we have with Buffalo is there is a plugin that will help us generate a lot of the boilerplate code that we can use to create users and manage that user authentication workflow. Let's take a look. I've broken out the pieces for adding user authentication to our app in these 4 pieces. This allows us to test each step as we go. So the first would be to take our user model and add a password hash and the password. You can see we're saving the password hash to the database, but we certainly don't want to save the raw password to the database. That's what that dash means. If you have a user model that requires a confirmation of that password, you would have a third value there, password confirm, but it's not required. So the second step would be to add a new user form. We did this last time with blogs, creating forms. We'd also need a route that would respond to this form, and that would create the new resource in our database. The third step is create another form, but this is for login. In this case, we're not creating a new resource per se, we're creating a session, and Buffalo manages that session all by itself. And the last step is going to be to add middleware for our routes. So this would help us make sure that only authenticated users can get to certain pages. It also helps us load and pass data about the current user, the logged in user, to a set of routes. So adding middleware requires 2 steps, just like adding any other HTTP handler. We register the handler, in our case in the app.go file, and then we have to define the logic for the handler. The handler looks a little different than a typical HTTP handler. We're not returning page content or some sort of response. We return a function that allows us to do some additional processing or add some logic, and that logic might determine which handler that is. So in our application, imagine we create a dashboard page. So we have a request to dashboard, so the app has to perform this middleware check. Inside there, it's going to determine if this user is allowed to see the page or not. If it's okay, we return that next handler, which would be the dashboard page. If not, we would redirect them. What that looks like in code is here. You can see on the second line, return function. So we're returning that function that will perform the check. If it fails, we can redirect the traffic. If it passes, we just call next on the Buffalo context. And context is going to know what is the next handler in the process here. Okay, so let's look at how this plays out in our Buffalo app. Fortunately, there is a Buffalo plugin called buffalo-auth. What are plugins? This page on the Buffalo docs goes through some of the basics. If you're familiar with plugins in other systems, they tend to follow a pattern where you install the code inside of your app somewhere where you can access it and call it and run the functions there. Buffalo plugins tend to use generators, so they will generate code on top of what you already have. And that will be problematic because we've already started in our application. But we do have some ways we can work around that. We'll follow the steps here to get started. To make it easier to see what happens with this plugin, we're going to start with a new project. We'll create this new project called Auth Demo. Just to confirm again, we're using Buffalo version 16.26. So now if we go to the plugin page, we'll follow the steps here. And we'll see the next step here is to use Buffalo Generate. So like I said, plugins typically generate code. It won't create this user module as a module within our app. It's going to overwrite some of the files we already have here. Okay, let's take a look at what we have. So because this is a Git repository, over here on the side it is showing us which files have changed, and we'll just run through those real quick. So if we remember our steps, step 1 was to add the password fields to our user model. Go over here. We can see those here. It also has a migration to put that data in the database. And fortunately, we have some tests. Down here we have templates, a form for create a user, a form for creating that new session, which would be the login form, some handlers, right, for those routes, and obviously those routes are defined in here somewhere. So let's compare our project here on the left to the new Buffalo project on the right. Remember, we created some custom fields on our user, and if we run buffalo-auth plugin, we're going to lose all of that. The new fields are email, password hash, password, and password confirm. The next thing we see from the buffalo-auth plugin is this create function. We can see it tries to clean up the email, strings to lower, and it also generates a password hash using bcrypt. So if that step works, then we store the password hash on the user model, and then we run the database transaction validate and create. So this is something we are going to want. If we look further down, there is this validate function, and because email and password are going to be required fields in order to save the database, so we're going to want that. Our original validate function is here. We were making sure first name, last name, and age were required fields. Probably don't need those. And the last piece from this user model is validate create is going to make sure that the password and password confirmation fields are the same. So that takes care of the user model. The next step would be to add a migration. The auth plugin has also generated this migration for us. We can use the Buffalo CLI to generate an empty migration file. The auth plugin is creating the users table. We already have that. We just need to add some columns. And we can do that with this simple format here. Now we can try to run that migration. If we look in the actions folder, we also have two new files here, auth and users. We can start with users. If we copy all of that over, let's take a look what we get. Users new is going to show the form to create a new user. Users create is going to respond to that post request to create a new user. There are two other functions down here, these two handlers that are used as middleware, set current user and authorize. Remember, Buffalo manages sessions for us. This middleware is used to inspect the session and try to find a user in the database. If it finds one, then it will add that to the context and pass it on to the next handler. Authorize is the middleware that we can use for gating certain pages or certain routes on our site. The last piece to look at quick just to get users working is templates. There's a form for the new user and then a form to log in. So we'll copy those into our app and see what works. So if we go to our site and open this new page, users/new, here we see that form. Enter some values and save it. So that worked. The page redirected us back to home. And if you want, you can double check in your database and make sure that that user was saved. So now let's come back to the middleware and see how we can start to use this. We didn't plan for every page on our site to have authentication requirements, so we're going to comment that out for now. One way to add middleware is one by one on each route. If we think of what route we might want to add authentication for, one obvious choice is the blogs create. We don't want to let everybody create blogs. So we can do that by this, adding the middleware as the route which calls the next handler in line. Okay, so we're reloading this form page. It seems to work. What if we try it with a private tab? In this case, we get this error because the auth new route isn't found. Because this is a private tab, Buffalo didn't find a user in the session cookie, so it's trying to redirect. So it looks like this is working. So that's a good first step. The next step is to review our middleware even further. Let's go back and look what happens when we create a new blog. If you remember, each blog needs a user. Here in this blog's new handler, what were we doing? We were just grabbing the last user in the database and saving it. Well, that's not going to work anymore. You have to log in order to see the blog form, and on that blog form we're going to want to know which user you are. That's what this set current user middleware is going to do. And this is one way to build up middleware for a specific route. Authorize first, then try to set current user, and then call the blogs create handler. So what does that middleware do? Set current user takes the session, tries to find a user, and it's going to add it on the context, and the value of that is going to be current user. So if we jump into our blogs handler, this blogs create form, what if we tried to add a message that said welcome back user? How would we do that? This is a line to try to pull the user off the context from the current user value. We could pull that user out and do some more logic, but we don't really need to. That context is going to go from here into the template. So all we need to do in this template is add a simple line, welcome back. So now if we reload the form, now we know who the user is. So that method of stacking the middleware on the form works. Next is to add that to the post request when we submit that form. Let's look at the handler for that. That's blogs new. So remember we said we don't need to look up the user here when we do the form, but we will use it down here when we respond to that post request. So now we're not looking up the last user, we're going to use the user from the session. So instead of checking for that database error, we can just see if the ID on this user is nil and redirect. And down here for that blog, we're saving the user as the author of this blog. And that should be it. So that worked. One thing to point out about middleware in Buffalo is there are different ways to apply it. The buffalo-auth plugin by default adds the set current user and authorize middleware on the entire application. We don't want to do that. So we can apply middleware on specific routes, or as we see here, we can skip and remove middleware. Buffalo also allows us to define groups, and you can apply middleware to just a group. If we jump over to the Buffalo middleware documentation page, there's a number of examples about how this works. So the last piece we can add here is a login and logout form. If we look at the buffalo-auth plugin, we can see how it does it. Again, the middleware is added to the entire app and then it's removed for some of these routes. So we can take the opposite approach and create the routes and then just apply the middleware to those. So we're adding those routes. Now let's add the templates. So if we try this auth landing page, we can see we get a link for sign in and a link for register. In most applications, we don't want to show the sign in form if the user's already signed in. The landing form is trying to do something like that. If the current user email is found, then show the sign out button and hide the other two. In our case, this user, we should still be logged into the browser. So let's go update these routes and add some middleware to do that check. Okay, so now we've added that middleware just like we did for blogs, and as we expect, it's showing sign out and John Doe. So the last step would be to add the handlers for these routes. So if we try to click on this sign out link, it doesn't seem to be working. That's because, again, we have to add the middleware so that the current user is passed into the context properly. For me, the logout button isn't working properly. The auth plugin creates it as a link. In my experience, we want to change that to a form so that we properly pass the delete method with form. Now when we get this page, this is a button for a form, we can successfully log out. If you notice, we try to log back in, it's not letting us go to the /auth page, it's trying to redirect us to auth new. And why is that? But look at the auth plugin, it does skip authorize for the landing page. So we were trying to do authorize here. If we remove that, it should allow us to go to that page. And here we get those buttons for sign in and register as we would expect. And there we can see that the full user login cycle works. So here, this is a quick demo of how to use the auth plugin in Buffalo. We can see there are a couple hiccups. If we have a project already in motion, it'll be a lot easier if you're starting from a fresh Buffalo project to run the auth plugin and generate all the code you need. But the most important thing to take away from this is how middleware works in Buffalo. Thanks for watching.